Hello, I'm Oskari Lähdeaho, and today we are going to figure out how to calculate road traffic emissions and how to analyze the results. So let's get right into it. Firstly, for the calculation of emission inventory, you need three main ingredients, which are you need traffic volumes of the specific section or site or whatever location you want to figure out the emissions that are produced in it. Then you would need emission factors for specific vehicles that consist of this within these traffic volumes. And lastly, you would need distances that these vehicles are traveling within the studied site or section of a road or whatever it might be that you need. So let's illustrate this with a simple example case. This is a normal trucking gig for Transito traffic going from Finnish Hamina-Kotka harbor, a truck carrying a sea container from that harbor to Russian border and from there further on. But in our this specific case, we are only going to calculate what are the CO2 emissions within the Finnish side of this operation. So at first we should figure out the emission unit for CO2, so how many grams of CO2 per kilometer is a semi-trailer truck carrying a 16.05 tons load, which represents a sea container that is, in our case, carried with ship to Hamina-Kotka and then loaded to the truck and then further on carried to Russia. So firstly, to figure out the CO2 emissions that a partial load of 16.05 tons makes per kilometer, we need to use this kind of equation. The partial loads emission unit we can get when we figure out how much does this kind of truck emit CO2 when it's empty, when it has full load, and this we can figure out from the Finnish Technical Research Center's database. So let's go check what they have in there. So here, this is the first main page. We must navigate to transport unit emissions. Then from here we can see road transport and freight. And here we go down and here we can see semi-trailer. So the sea containers are usually carried with this type of truck. So as we are driving from the harbor of Hamina-Kotka to the Russian border, it's mostly consisting of highway driving. So we are going to use those emission factors. So here you can see semi-trailer combination, vehicle mass is 40 tons, but we are interested in this payload maximum capacity, which is 25 tons. And here we have different emissions, and we need to find from down here we can find carbon dioxide emissions, grams per kilogram, and grams per kilometer. And the most common one, I think, as it is for now, is Euro 3 truck for this type of operation, Euro 3 engine technology, Euro standard of this classification. And we can see here that while the load is empty, it emits 627 grams of carbon dioxide per kilometer, whereas while it's full, the same indicator would be 974. So we factor those into our equation that was presented here, and we can get as the answer that while carrying one sea container, approximately the truck emits 850 grams of carbon dioxide per kilometer driven. So when we have that figure out, we can go further on with our case in here. So we assume that the truck comes from Russian side without any cargo. So the first half of the trip has we use the emission factor for empty load, and we uh, multiply that with the distance from the Russian border to the Haminakotka harbor, which is 69.6 kilometers. And thus we get the answer that during the first section of the trip, we emit, or the semi-trailer truck emits approximately 43,640 grams of carbon dioxide. Now, when we arrive to the Haminakotka, the truck is loaded with the sea container, and now we need to use this emission factor that we just figured out. And so we got that the second part of the trip is 59,144 grams worth of carbon dioxide. Now it's pretty easy to figure out the emissions for the whole trip. We just add them together, and it's a little bit over 100 kilograms of carbon dioxide that has been emitted during this trip. Now, in freight traffic, it's more often than not interesting to see how to represent or present uh, uh, the result in ton kilometers, so we can figure out how much emissions we emit per ton of cargo transported with this vehicle. With certain type of cargo, this could be also used to figure out how much one product its travel emitted CO2 or caused CO2 emissions. So our previous case was short and sweet and simple enough, but nevertheless uh, important for example companies who want to figure out what their typical operation, for example, might cause, how much it would cause emissions. And it's also important so we can build bigger cases, such as here we can build or I have built here 2018 E18 road from Helsinki, outskirts of Helsinki, until the Russian border, the emission inventory for the whole year. So in Finland, thankfully, we have our transport agency, transport infrastructure agency provides us with open access data that is gathered from these blue dots, which are automatic traffic volume measurement stations. And these stations measure every vehicle that goes past them, their direction, speed, and also their length, which allows the uh, measurement stations to automatically classify the vehicle, whether it's, for example, passenger car, a small delivery truck, semi-trailer truck, or as we have in Finland, we use a lot of full trailer trucks. It can separate the vehicle to these different classes. So let's take a look what kind of data these stations provide us. So here I have gathered uh, from every day of 2018 all the vehicles that have gone through the mentioned measurement points, which are listed here. uh, Transport Infrastructure Agency uses these specific codes, and it helps to organize this data, these measurement station codes. Uh, then we have the longer name to figure out where exactly it might be located. Then here we have the direction code. So one direction code of 1 means that the vehicle was traveling east in this case, and 2 means that it was traveling west on E18. And here we have the different classes. These are in Finnish, but these are passenger car, delivery truck, bus, semi-trailer truck, full trailer truck, passenger car with a trailer, and passenger car with a mobile home. And here we see that each hour the measurement station reports how many of specific type of vehicle went past this measurement point and what was the direction of that stack of cars or whichever vehicles. And here we see that the whole day is covered until midnight. And here I have made for my own convenience a summary that how many each type of vehicles went past this station here. So with this kind of data, we can uh, figure out the annual emission inventory. So here I have just numbered the sections all the way from Helsinki until the end, which is Russian border. And if we look at here, this is the station that we want to figure out the direction 1, and this is the station which we want to figure out the direction 2. So let's go a little bit back so I explain what that means. So this is the first station, and we want to figure out the direction 1 going this way, while also for this section we want to figure out this station's direction 2, so the traffic that is flowing this way, so we can figure out the overall emissions. Additionally, we need to figure out what is the distance between these stations, and when we add all the stations together, we get the whole longitude of the road, which is 171.2 kilometers. So let's check here. So for example, between the first and second measurement station, which represent the section 1, the distance is 4.7 kilometers. So we need to take the let's see here, we need to take the traffic volume going to direction 1, which is this variable. Then we need the second station's traffic volume going to the direction 2, which is this variable. And then we need to factor in the emission factor and multiply it also with the distance. And then we do this with every section of the road, every vehicle type, and every emission type. And for example, let's go a little bit down and we can find CO2 equivalent emissions, which are interesting to us, because CO2 equivalent is a unit that tells us how much of different greenhouse gases these vehicles have emitted. This greenhouse gases include CO2, carbon dioxide, methane, CH4, and N2O, uh, which is also a very vicious greenhouse gas. Uh, so all of these three gases are represented in a way that what is their global warming potential uh, uh, reliant to carbon dioxide. So, for example, methane is 25 times more vicious or potential global warming greenhouse gas. So, we need to multiply the amount of methane with 25 as a factor. Same way for N2O, this factor is even higher, 298. So the global warming potential is 298 times larger for N2O than it is for carbon dioxide. So when we calculate all of this, we get some kind of these figures. So here I have presented to you all the different greenhouse gases and also represented them in a CO carbon dioxide equivalent form. Uh, as a reference, I also used uh, DEFRA, which is database by developed in United Kingdom. Now it gives us larger values because it's more general. It doesn't take into account the different Euro standards. It just gives us a approximation of what is the average of all of the traffic, but it has different emission factors for different vehicle types. Also in Finland, we have in all the distributed fuels that we have 11.5% bio component, biofuel component, which furthermore gives us lower values on these greenhouse gases. And here in the middle, we can see some kind of average because it's always good when you measure these type of things to have multiple references to see to triangulate your way what could be the situation in reality. Okay, so you might think, why is it so small share, only 1.5% of all the emissions by transportation sector in Finland? But most of the CO2 emissions happen in uh, living habitat centers like cities where people live, mostly work and spend their free time. And approximately one fourth or one third of all the CO2 emissions happen in within cities, according to the Finnish Technical Research Center's database on traffic. And mostly the smaller vehicles like passenger cars, motorcycles, vans are responsible for approximately 64% of all the CO2 emissions from road transport. While E18 road is important for especially freight traffic and traffic between the cities alongside this road, it's not so intensively used as city streets or the highways between the three bigger cities of Finland, which are Helsinki, Turku, and Tampere, that are located west of our case here. As we can see, if we look at the CO2 emission sources of E18, it's pretty similar to the points that were presented in the previous slide. What is interesting of Finnish characteristic is that most of their semi-trailer trucks only account for 14%, whereas full trailer trucks account for 18%. This is due because uh, the freight that is transported within Finland is more often than not transported with full trailer truck, whereas semi-trailers are used for international traffic, for example, sea containers or traffic between Finland and Russia. So that was a little tasting of what we could analyze from the results that we got. So now let's widen the scope a little bit and look at the past decade on the E18 so we can do even more interesting analysis. So similarly that I already showed, I built a model of or emission inventory for all the years from all the 10 years from past decade. And here in the first graph, for example, we can see how the total amount of vehicles alongside the 18 has been developing. So there has been some growth, and then in the beginning of the decade it has stagnated and started dropping. But interestingly enough, after 2015, we can see sharp rising, and it seems to be still growing as of now. Below, I have used 10, or how many is there? 8 measurement points that are consistent throughout the decade. So it gives us accurate picture of how in the different parts of the road the amounts have been developing. It seems like more or less it keeps the same, but in Kotka, I think the first was from Kotka was west side of the city, and it has been dropping and haven't recovered yet, and the others have taken over. Here we can see the dispersion of the different vehicle types of that are used in the E18. So Legend is down here, and we can see that passenger cars are dominating. 70 to 80% of vehicles are passenger cars, and all the others come after that. The notable ones are full trailer and semi-trailer trucks that are used, especially on E18, because freight traffic uses that road quite a lot. So here we can see what mostly important interests us in this study, the different greenhouse gas and air pollutants. Now I divided this into 4 tables. The division doesn't mean anything else, but the absolute amounts just are in these tables fall in the same ballpark. So that's why I chose, for example, to have CO2 equivalents and CO2 in one table, whereas here is methane, N2O, and sulfur emissions. So what we can see, the big picture here is that CO2 emissions are stagnant, little bit rising, but compared to the rising amount of traffic, it seems that they are not drastically rising, even though the amount of emission sources are rising. For the other emissions, it seems that they are lowering year by year, and this is goes according to the Euro standardization project, and which aims to regulate the traffic so that less and less emissions would be produced. Interestingly enough, N2O uh, emissions have been rising ever since 2015. Now, this gives us quite an interesting thing to analyze. So, what could be the reason behind this? Uh, and that N2O is emissions are rising and other emissions are stagnating or have been decreasing a lot during the years. Uh, so oh, one reason that is quite obvious is that uh, N nitrous oxide emissions are very harmful to humans and environment. They are air pollutants, and they are one main target of the Euro classification. And lots of catalysts to the cars have been installed to reduce this NO or nitrous oxide emissions, but these catalyst converters have one problem that when they are not working as fully intended, they they transform this nitrous oxide emissions into N2O emissions in the process, and especially in the diesel engines, this is problem. And when it slips through the catalysator, the N2O emissions can sharply rise. And I think that is one of the reasons why we can see this figure in this table right here. So let's still go back to the dispersion of emissions. So these are the sources of CO2 equivalent, so greenhouse gases all together, and what are the main sources. So not surprisingly, the dominant vehicle type, the passenger cars, are responsible for most of the emissions throughout years. But then these full trailer and semi-trailer trucks, even though they do not compete in absolute traffic volume amount, the amount of emissions they are producing are quite significant in the big picture. So let's go back to the N2O emissions. So as I said, these emissions are a byproduct in conversion in diesel engines. And so if we want to, it's a hard dilemma since we want less nitrous oxide emissions since they are harmful to life, but then again we don't want to produce uh, a lot of N2O emissions since it's 300 times approximately a stronger greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So what could we do? So as we have established, the diesel engines are the main culprits behind N2O emissions. So what could be done about that? Uh, as we know, road freight transport mostly uses diesel, and could this fuel be replaced with substituting technology or different fuels? Uh, as it is for now, hydrogen is too costly to be implemented for now in uh, not only road transport of freight, but also individual use. It's only at, dare I say, concept level. Electric cars, they are quite quite a lot of hype behind them, but as it is for now, they are not reasonable costs yet, and they have a little bit too low autonomy. For example, in Finland, where trucks have to travel quite long distances. But however, LNG could be one of the solutions for the problem of rising N2O, since its its technology is mature enough to substitute diesel trucks in terms of costs and reliability and uh, autonomy it offers to the trucks. And what is more interesting is that it does not produce N2O emissions, since it doesn't need the converters that are present in the diesel engines, because LNG doesn't produce or produces little to none nitrous oxygen emissions. What needs to be taken into account is that using LNG, or simply put methane, in the road traffic will put us at the risk of methane slip, which means that unburned methane from the fuel tank of the vehicle slips through and goes to the atmosphere. And methane is 25 times more, or has 25 more times more global warming potential than CO2 emissions. So, for example, if we want to create a hypothetical scenario where we calculate an inventory, emission inventory with, and we decide that, for example, we have 1/4 of our truck fleet runs on methane. We should take this methane slip into account in the overall inventory, so that we can get reliable results for our calculation and analysis. But that's all from me for now, and thank you for listening, and see you soon.